thing I want to talk about here is the issue of trust. Trust between employees and managers is undoubtedly the number one issue in successful leadership and management today. And I want to tell you a story in terms of a metaphor here. I was doing these interviews, and I was working with a company in Tampa. They're a PEO, which is like full service human resource company, $1 billion company. And I'm working with their board, and every time I talk to them, they tell me about this girl, Laura. You know, Laura one day will be CEO. Laura's great. Laura just got promoted. Laura's going to be a VP. Laura's going to be a president. Laura. Laura worked out of their Tampa office. So a couple months later, after doing the senior board retreat, I said, hey, I'm going to be in Tampa. I'd love to interview Laura. And they said, well, that'd be great. So I'm sitting there to interview Laura, and I'm sitting in this palatial boardroom, and I'm waiting for Laura to make her grand entrance, and she makes me wait, and I'm 55 years old, and that really pisses me off. What's it with young people and telling time? So Laura comes into the room, and immediately I melt, because she's got a smile that would melt an iceberg. You know, she's obviously charismatic. She wasn't beautiful in a stunning way, but there was an air about her, an aura about her, a charisma about her. Incidentally, Laura was a Wharton grad, so she had an Ivy League pedigree. She's probably making about 230, 240 grand a year. I would judge her to be about 34, 35 years old. And the board and the CEO can't wait to make her CEO. So I can't wait to interview her and see what makes her tick. Anybody else curious? So one of the things I did, because I'm not the most advanced researcher in the world, nor am I the sharpest tool in the shed, obvious by now, eh? One of the things I did was, this is kind of funny, I put a timeline down when I did the interviews, and I said, give me the 5 most significant events in your life, because I was trying to figure out what they perceived to be significant. And nobody would answer the question. It took me 2 months to realize they wouldn't answer the question because they didn't like being told they had 5 significant events. So I'm going, well, I only had 3. I had 7. Who are you to tell me that this isn't significant, you know? So I changed the question, just give me some of the significant events in your life, and it was much better. You can learn from that. So anyway, you know, Laura has this piece of paper, and she puts a notch here on the timeline, and a notch here on the timeline, and a notch here on the timeline. And then all of a sudden she looks at the first notch on the timeline, and her eyes start to well with tears, and she obviously gets emotional. And I'm thinking, oh, Mike, now you really stepped in it, you know? And when you do these, also not a surprise, when you do these interviews, you got to be very careful. So I'm immediately retreating now, you know, from the interview. And I'm going, hey, Laura, don't worry about it. We don't have to do it. And she's going, no, I want to go through this. And I said, no, we don't have to do the interview, or let's not do the timeline. I got another question I want to ask you. She says, no, I want to do the timeline. And I'm going, Laura, no. She goes, yes. And everybody knows what it's like to argue with a female, especially young, so I conceded immediately. So I said, what's the first significant event on your timeline? Anybody curious? Right? And she said, the first significant event I remember in my life is I was in middle school, and I went to the fall middle school dance. And it was the first time I danced with a boy, and the first time I kissed a boy, and that was the first significant event in my life. CEO, eh? Immediately in my mind, I got to be honest with you, immediately in my mind I'm thinking, well, if I leave Tampa now and drive to Atlanta, I could be home for pardon the interruption. I'm thinking, what's next? We went to Baskin Robbins and got bubble gum? I hate to have such a male bias to this, but I was expecting something far more profound. And I'm thinking, oh boy, Mike, let's just get out of here, you know. And she goes to the second event. I said, what's the second event? Like I really cared. I said, what's the second event? She goes, 2 weeks after the dance, my dad moved our family to San Francisco. Anybody here ever move their kids? Or move when they were kids? Unless you've been through it, you got no clue. Unless you've been through it, you don't understand the anxieties and the pain and the splintering that goes on in a family when you move teenagers. Now here's a girl from Tampa. It's middle school, so help me out. How old is she? 14, 15 or something, right? And she moves from Tampa in the 1980s to San Francisco in the 1980s. Who thinks she had a little bit of a culture shock? I said, wow, that's really interesting. How did you feel? She said, oh, Mr. Muetzel, because I am old. She said, Mr. Muetzel, she said, it was terrible, man. First they had me in a public school, and that didn't work. And I went to a private school, and that was even worse. And then finally they put me in parochial school, and it was awful. And I said, how did you feel? And she said, I felt terrible because I knew that, I don't remember his name, Johnny, and my friends in Tampa We're hanging out at the mall, going to the football games Friday night. And anybody that's been through this, you all know how it works. You call each other every day, and then the next week it's every other day. Then you get a letter once a month. And pretty soon the kid that moved away is totally the outsider. And she was hurt. She was deeply hurt. So now I'm back into the interview emotionally. And I said, what's the third significant event on your timeline? She said, 3 years after we moved to San Francisco, listen carefully, IBM laid off my dad. I can't believe they did that. My dad is a great guy. This struck me because in the research for the book, I had done a lot of work on this trust issue. And in the 1980s alone, IBM, AT&T, and General Motors, those three companies alone laid off 3.8 million workers. Okay? Three companies. Somebody tell me the size of Generation X? So if the size of the generation is 40 million, and 3.8 got laid off by three companies, what does that tell you? I mean, start to extrapolate. 1.5 kids, a family, or just those three companies. I'm pretty sure in the 1980s, more companies had layoffs than those three. Maybe, right? It was the decade of the LBO. It was the decade of the merger. And it was the decade of corporate priority over personal employees, the origin. We're Big Blue starts to get older. She moves up the food chain. And what happens now with Laura? She's now 20 years old, or 25 years old, or 28 years old. Enron, WorldCom. I mean, where do you start and stop? So there's this huge chasm of trust. Incidentally, Laura's no longer with the company. You know, he's going, Mike, you're telling me it's our responsibility to build trust? Hey, wait a second, man. We pay 5% above the industry. We have daycares at every one of our facilities. We allow people to telecommute. We have 100% tuition reimbursement. When do the employees start to take some accountability for something? Anybody, you're telling me I need to build trust? And I said, no, man. I'm not telling you need to build trust. Not at all. I'm telling you it doesn't exist. And if you don't have trust, you can't have loyalty.
Hi, this is Mike Muetzel. Hey, thanks so much for checking out the video. For more information on the 4 generations of work or change in leadership or some other things that will hopefully make you think, come visit us. www.unlockthemysteries.com. Thanks again.